Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 21st, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer joins us today. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me again, Nima.
John, we had a meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky in which Donald Trump, in the aftermath, said he's not going to send Tomahawk missiles. For the time being, he's not going to send them to Ukraine. And then it came to the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And he said before that meeting, we're going to have the foreign ministers of the Secretary of State of the United States and the foreign minister of Russia to meet each other to find, to discuss the main issues. It seems that, you know, CNN reported that that meeting was postponed. What is the latest on that meeting between the two foreign ministers, Secretary of State and Foreign Minister of Russia?
Thank you for the question, Nima, and thank you for mentioning the culprits in this affair. There's been no postponement of something that hasn't been agreed. That was said by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov yesterday. And Ryabkov went on to say, we do not confirm what some Western sources, I'm reading it in front of me, wrote yesterday. Now, that was yesterday, Mr. Ryabkov. A few minutes or a couple of hours ago, Foreign Minister Lavrov, following a meeting he had in Moscow with the Foreign Minister of Ethiopia, made this statement. So what if I read it out, because it says it quicker and better than I can. We agreed to continue these telephone contacts, Mr. Lavrov said, to better understand where we are and how to move in the right direction. Let me just comment that when Mr. Lavrov says we'll continue telephone contacts with Rubio, he means the telephone. So what in fact hasn't happened that was suggested last week during and after the Zelensky meeting at the cabinet room luncheon with Trump, that Rubio and Lavrov would meet in a place, that's not happening. Instead, there was yesterday's telephone call, and now Lavrov is saying we will continue the telephone contacts. Then Lavrov goes on, I was surprised today to read that according to CNN, the meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump may be postponed, since after our conversation with Mr. Rubio yesterday, American officials came to the conclusion that Russia's position has almost not changed in the time that's passed since the Alaska meeting, and remains within its initial maximalist demands. That's the US term, also used in London. Putin is making maximalist demands. Lavrov rejects what he called the unscrupulous of many media in the West, as CNN is famous for this, and they've also attacked Reuters. I want to officially confirm, says Mr. Lavrov, that Russia has not changed its position compared to the understandings that were achieved during the long negotiations of Vladimir Putin and Trump in Alaska. That's very important to say that they were long negotiations. Well, they weren't exactly long negotiations. They were cut short. They were intended to be 4.5 hours. They were cut short to 2 hours. The press conference that Putin and Trump had was scheduled on State Department papers, and we've talked about those papers which leaked on this program before. That was cut from about 45 minutes to about 12 minutes, 8 of which were taken up by President Putin. So there are controversies, there are issues, there are in fact versions, different versions from the American side, slightly different versions, though not as disparate as the American side, from the Russians. Just remember, to kick off with somewhere where we've been before, let's not regard President Trump as the master negotiator in this. On stage, what we have is a ventriloquist and a doll. And the doll is Trump. The ventriloquists are numerous. There are several of them, including General Dan Kane, whose presence at the table at the lunch with Zelensky last week was visible. I've seen it in the photographs, but he's not mentioned. That's important too, but we'll come back to that.
John, we had a statement, British government, Starmer together with Zelensky, talking about an immediate ceasefire, which was addressed by Lavrov. He said an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine would only mean that the most of the country would remain under the control of the Nazis.
Yes,
I think it's still the case for the talks between the foreign minister of Russia and the secretary of state, and even between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. They cannot. What is the problem that the United States together with Europeans are not, they're not willing to understand the Russian position, in my opinion. What is that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Why are they not willing to understand Russia's position about an immediate ceasefire, which Russia says what that would mean for them?
Well, let's go back to the general point.
Because Russia, the main point, John, on the part of Russian is, if we do that, Ukraine would remain in the hand of the Nazis. They're not. Exactly. They want to denazify Ukraine. Go ahead.
Yes, exactly so. And Lavrov has just repeated exactly what you've said. An immediate ceasefire is unacceptable to the Russian side, because all it will mean is that the other side will take a pause from their steadily advancing defeat on all sections of the front and deeper. There were major attacks on Chernigov, Odessa, and elsewhere in the last 24 hours. That's correct. You put it very well. But let's do two things here. First of all, remember, Trump is the doll. There are other ventriloquists. The Russian side has been trying to say there's a difference between the Europeans and Trump. Well, it's the difference between one group of ventriloquists and the doll. But Russian side is officially and publicly not going to say that. Now, let's be clear what Trump himself said on this issue. He was asked in the aircraft, and I can't recall on the weekend whether it was on his way to take the weekend playing golf off in Florida or on the way back. Let me read it, got it in front of me. On Friday, the newspaper person asked, "You said you had a cordial meeting with President Zelensky." Trump: "I did." Question: "During that meeting, did you tell him he needed to cede all the Donbas region to Russia?" Trump: "This is the part. No, we never discussed that. We think that what they should do is just stop at the lines where they are, the battle lines." You have a battle line right now, says Trump, and the rest is very tough to negotiate. If you're going to say you take this, we take that, there's so many different permutations. So what I say is that they should stop right now at the battle lines, go home, stop killing people, and be done. Question: what do you think should happen with the Donbas region? Trump: let it be cut the way it is. It's cut up right now. I think 78% of the land is already taken by Russia. You leave it that way, the way it is right now. They can negotiate something later on down the line. But I said, and he's talking to Zelensky on Friday, cut and stop at the battle line. Go home, stop fighting, stop killing people. Now, that's what Trump said. So there's no change in the sense that the ventriloquists sitting in Brussels, in London, in Paris and Berlin, especially Berlin, Merz has been a big repeating promoter of immediate ceasefire, are saying and reinforcing what Trump's saying. In fact, they're prompting him. He responds to the prompt and then responds to different prompts when they pop up in Washington, whether that's coming from the Pentagon, whether it's coming from CIA, whether it's coming from the White House itself. That's the way it is. And therefore, Trump invites the prompts. But maybe we'll come back to this in a little minute, because here's a question that hasn't been asked before. What impact on Europe would it have if Trump stopped the war? But let's come back to that in a minute.
Yeah. John, does Donald Trump care about Europe to ask that?
Well, wait a minute. I'm a Russia correspondent. It's not my job to get inside.
But so far, what we've seen from Donald Trump and his administration, he's just, all he cares about is increasing NATO, the budget of NATO. Nothing of, even with the weapons that he's going to sell to Europe, they're not going to deliver those weapons anytime soon. That's the problem. Why is that so difficult for Europeans to understand their position?
Well, sorry for laughing at what does President Trump really care about? Well, presidents, and he's nothing new about this, care about their power. He cares a bit more, or lots more than some presidents, about turning his power into immediate balance sheet cash in all his businesses, the businesses he runs directly through his sons. So turning power into money is number one. Number two, preserving that power, reclaiming it from the Congress if that's necessary, and protecting it at the next midterm election, always 2 years away from election, right? And then protecting it and preserving it for your next term if you can run for re-election, as most presidents hope to do, or if you can't, as Trump's position is at the moment, it's to make sure that your successors, or possibly yourself, if you can come up with a constitutional way of doing it, preserve your power. I mean, that's what they care about. Okay, but if you like, we can go back to this fundamental problem of power and money. Imagine what would happen if Trump stops the war. What would happen in Europe? Now, from Trump's point of view, here are some numbers to think about. At the moment, Trump's line is, we are going to get rich, me, my sons, Witkoff's sons, Lutnick's sons, etc., my son-in-law, Kushner, and so on. We're all getting very rich right now. But if the war stops, what happens to NATO's 5% commitment, the increase of NATO spending to 5% of GDP? That's what the Europeans have all agreed to. And in return, the Europeans have agreed, we pay you the money, President Trump. You align yourself with keeping the war going. Now, suppose the war ends, Trump stops it, gets his Nobel Peace Prize, as President Putin is proposing to recommend for him next year, then there can be no credibility anymore inside Europe for the 5% GDP commitment. Now, that means no purchasing of US military goods. That's how the Trump administration proposes that America will get rich. It's not mega, it's Mara, make America rich again. Okay, now let's just look at current spending of Europe at the current 2%, roughly speaking, GDP level. Some countries more, like Poland, some countries less, amounts to $1.2 trillion. But if it goes to 5%, I've calculated, we reach about $3.3 trillion at 5%. So Trump is shooting, and the Europeans have agreed to spend another $1.1 trillion. And from Trump's point of view, that goes into the American pocket. And his family, as I've said, Witkoff, Feinberg at Pentagon, and all the others been in business calculate that 1.1 extra trillion dollars generates on their usual commission rates rather large number of billion dollars. For whom? For themselves. Now, how can Europe say stop the war and we can't pay? Stopping the war will not only cost the US 1.1 extra trillion dollars, but it will destroy the internal political consensus of each of these countries. For the first time, the opposition parties, the Alliance for Germany, AfD in Germany, the Reform Party.
Alternative for Deutschland.
I'm sorry, I keep saying that by mistake. Alternative for Germany is the correct term. I tried to correct it last week, but didn't get to it. AfD is Alternative for Germany. That's the leading opposition party in Germany, opposed to staying at war with Russia. Merz is suppressing them. In England, it's not all that different. The Reform Party, which has been endorsed, for example, by Elon Musk, is running at 35% in the polls, way ahead of Starmer's Labour Party, notwithstanding his so-called landslide election. So each of these dynamics, France is different and so on, and we explained these last week, would be remarkably challenged, and these weak political leaders in Europe potentially destroyed if Trump stops the war. So Trump actually doesn't want it. Neither do the Europeans. They're not mad. They're not they're not coalition of the brain dead, as some podcasters want to say. They've calculated the money. They've calculated the power. It's politics and cash. Now, how to get the war solved in such a way that Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize means creating a fake end of the war as the Gaza peace plan, the so-called Trump peace plan, represents. It's a fake. The ceasefire has lasted a few days. The Israelis are back killing dozens of Palestinians a day and are resuming the war. So is Russia, having looked exactly at and endorsing Trump's so-called peace plan in Gaza, is Russia looking at the value of the credibility of Trump on any undertaking for peace? Are they concluding that they can reach any undertaking with Trump that would last long? No, of course not. But if Trump says, let's end it at the battle lines and negotiate later, that's profoundly what the Europeans want, just as you said, Nima, to rearm, to continue the war when they're in a losing position, losing worse and worse every day. So it's unacceptable to the Russian side when Trump says it, when Zelensky says it, when Starmer, Macron, Merz and Maloney say it. It's equally unacceptable because it's fake.
Yeah. John, you know the nature of the relationship between the United States and Russia. When you see someone like Kirill Dmitriev coming out and posting talking with Elon Musk, he says, imagine connecting the United States and Russia. And he's talking about the tunnel, Putin-Trump tunnel, a 70-mile link, symbolizing the unity. And even he talks about the company that can do it. That costs $65 billion. It can be reduced to $8 billion. Do these people? These people are in the business. They talk. They know how to communicate within themselves. But when it comes to the nature of the relationship between Russia and the United States, how much of that is related to the economy of those countries, and how much of that is related to the ideology, the nature or the identity of these two countries?
Again, a good question and a very big one. Let me try to answer it this way. There has always been a group of Russians, well-educated, highly articulate in both Russian, English, and other languages, often educated abroad, who think they understand very well the countries from which they came as educated trainees. Dmitriev was educated at high school, university, and graduate school in the United States. He thinks like an American. He also represents a faction, a business faction in Russia, the oligarch faction, which arose in 1996 and has been preserved in different forms until now, which was so fond of the United States, it listed its companies on the New York or NASDAQ stock exchanges. It put its children into high school, just like Dmitriev, and then sent them to universities like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and the California universities, and who buried their assets for safety from Russian taxation, from Russian corporate accountability, and from the instability, as they saw it, of their own fortunes in Russia. They buried their assets in the United States. They built their ski lodges, as Abramovich did in Colorado, their beach houses in Miami near Trump's Mar-a-Lago. This is how they thought the future would be. They continue to have some influence on the Kremlin in Moscow. What do they think they know about the country they preferred to live in and prefer their children to have citizenship of than their homeland? Well, they think that they understand the way to influence US decision-making is by bribing it, by paying for it. They apply their business methods to the political realm, and they're not necessarily wrong in the US. They've been more effective in bribery in Moscow, however, than they've been effective in Washington, because this war has largely, through the sanctions war, deprived them of their real estate. Abramovich can't go home to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where he owns half a street. Oleg Deripaska can't go home near Dubont Circle in Washington, D.C., where he had a house that's all locked up, and so on. The sanctions war against Putin has extended to what the US and the British have always called the circle around Putin, how to influence Putin to stop the war, put sanctions on the oligarchs. Each side, Dmitriev versus Trump and Musk, and we'll come back to that in a minute, and the US and British side imposing sanctions on the oligarchs, think that the oligarch theory of power is the one that works. Only it doesn't. It doesn't. The Russian side we can criticize, as they deserve, for having a simple-minded political theory. First, that they could influence US policy making to favor Russia by cultivating the Jewish lobby in Washington. The Russian side in Soviet days and the Russian side since 91 have believed that the Jews influence the Zionists, the Israel lobby, influences the presidency so powerfully that if you cultivate them at their root, meaning at the moment President Netanyahu, that will influence Washington policy making more favorably to Russia. Well, it doesn't work that way. It hasn't worked. Second, they've come to the view that money talks. I've just explained that. That doesn't work either. The other side thinks the same. Punish the money men around Putin. Take their toys away, their cruising yachts in the Mediterranean, lock them up, etc., etc., and you'll get a change in Putin's war making. Well, it almost works and it doesn't work. Now, so two different theories of bribing each other have failed to stop the root cause conflict and thus the military conflict, which Russia is winning on the battlefield. So when money stops influencing, guns talk, and guns are winning this war, and they're Russian ones. Okay, that's how it is. But so what we've seen is an interesting display by Mr. Dmitriev of how American he thinks he is by pushing what he calls a symbol of peace. And he comes up, I'm sorry I'm laughing, but it's so predictable. It's so corny. He comes up with the Trump-Putin tunnel of peace under the Bering Strait. He picked the name out of the Trump international peace corridor that we've talked about before between Azerbaijan and the Turkish border across the bottom of Armenia, the Zangezur corridor. Did Mr. Dmitriev figure out that if Trump likes that as much as he told the Armenians and Azeris, then he's bound to love this one? There's a couple of problems, though. Never mind that Mr. Musk owns the boring company, which can drill under the sea. Russia's not bad at that too, but the idea is a bribe to Musk to bribe Trump. A symbol of peace is not what solves the root causes of the conflict. And that's so. Is Mr. Dmitriev's Twitter stream on this subject, and there have been lots of tweets, you've just quoted two of them, a sign of desperation on the part of the Russian oligarch faction of Mr. Dmitriev, that he's losing his capacity to influence the talks, which he attends across the table from his counterpart, Stephen Witkoff? Is it desperation measures, or is it increasing confidence? There are other more substantial efforts, and they've all failed. There was an effort on the part of the Russian side by Igor Sechin and Rosneft, the state oil company, to persuade ExxonMobil that if they persuaded Trump to lay off the sanctions, stop enforcing them, reduce the economic warfare for themselves and for the US side, ExxonMobil could have its concessions back in Sakhalin. That failed. Okay, ExxonMobil was pressured to say, this isn't going to go anywhere. We're not ready to resume. The Russian side said, you aren't ready to resume, we aren't ready to resume. So that's a much bigger deal. It's more than $8 billion. If ExxonMobil and Igor Sechin can't make a deal, Kirill Dmitriev, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump aren't going to make an $8 billion peace tunnel deal. But you see, I'm surprised that Dmitriev talks about symbols of peace when what's really meant's money, just like you said. $8 billion, a whopping saving on what the Sovs used to estimate. Guess where some of that money and whose pockets the difference goes? Of course, it's a huge Bering bribery scheme, BBS, not a Trump-Putin peace tunnel, but it's not working. Why? Because we're at war, and at war, arms make the difference, not money.
John, Europe, how is Europe, dealing with or managing the Trump administration? Is that Europe? Is that the deal? Is that NATO? Or is that something beyond that? The connection between the leaders in Europe and the establishment in the United States. How much? It seems to me that they have, look at Donald Trump, look at the administration. They came in talking about the minerals in Ukraine. It's all about nothing, just, it's waves of propaganda coming out and just distracting us from the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. And it seems these talks are leaning toward the same sort of, distractions. Don't you think that, after all, I'm talking about Kirill Dmitriev, and he wants to connect with, but is the establishment in the United States interested in economic ties, or they're mostly interested in, their main goal, their you know their main objective is the ideology they have, which would be the hegemony, which was mentioned in the Wolfowitz doctrine. Is that the core, or they may change their mind because of China, because of the rise of China? China is happening, and nobody's capable of competing with this gigantic country. Is that going to influence their mind, the establishment in the United States?
Golly, that's a big question, and part of it you've already answered. How to begin to answer? Let me try. There have been lots of attempts in recent US academic history to describe who the US establishment is. At the moment, we can talk about the deep state. A long time ago, a great American, C. Wright Mills, wrote a book called The Power Elite, in which he described essentially the relationship between money, business, power, politics, and military adventures in the United States, and how they concert their activities on war and business, and how they differ among themselves. I suppose I began as a student thinking that the power elite was motivated by ideology. I've grown up to think that first you look at the money, the structure of the economy, and you look at economic power as a base. You look at ideology as a production, a performance that the base pays for to serve its interests. And we won't get into anything that will bore everybody's pants off when they think they already left the university or left school. And we don't want to go through all of that. That's theory. But you did mention the difference between money, power, and ideology. So let's just say there's been several generations of argument about that in the United States, and several generations of argument about that in the schools of Europe and in the schools of the Soviet Union too. But if you look at a headline today, I'm just reading from today's, published 5 hours ago in the FT in London, the Japanese-owned propaganda outlet for business in London. The headline says, the US Army has just asked private equity groups, including Apollo, Carlyle, KKR, and Cerberus, to pitch meaty strategic projects to help service fund the $150 billion infrastructure overhaul, which the US Army is going to award as a bunch of contracts. Now, does that help illustrate the way the US establishment is trying to cash in on war making? It's normal. On the Russian side, we could go through an interesting analysis, though I don't because we're at war, of the relationship between the Russian oligarchs and war making, building military vehicles, building missiles, building drones, and so forth. The economies of these countries are now increasingly militarized. So the existing powers, the steel makers, the pipe makers, the digital industries, and so forth and so on, have to cash in because the cash is coming. So it makes good political sense to farm out your contracts and make sure that Trump gets a big chunk, and Peter Thiel, another major funder of Trump, gets a big chunk of what we've discussed as the Golden Dome in space. So on the ground, in space, everywhere you look, everybody's making money. Making money makes people happy. Making people happy, they kick off a few percent in Trump's direction for re-election. And they control the media, which generates what we read as the ideology. War's good. war is necessary because the Russians are going to threaten us, which is the ideological line. That's why at the bottom of the screen you can read "Long live Novichok." That's an ideological success by the British and then the Germans to pave the way to war making and pave the way to money making. So I think I've tried to go round and around. I hope it answers your question of how the US establishment thinks. It's the way money makers think. They don't think differently between Moscow, City of London, Paris, Frankfurt, and what have you. That's isn't a description of the way the world's going to go, but I hope it's an answer to your question. Is it?
Yeah. John, is that the reality that you've just mentioned? Is that appreciated in Russia, or you
Yes.
see? Yeah. How deep is the leadership in Russia, or you see the people who are involved, these people who have a lot of influence, even on negotiations in Russia? Do they really understand it? You're talking about the leadership, just Vladimir Putin and the foreign minister of Russia. How about the other people who are working with them? Are they totally in line with the grand policy of Russia?
Well, you're asking terrific questions today, Neiman. We don't have enough time to talk out the answers. How can I answer that one? First, I've spent, 30 years now in Russia analyzing the relationships that you just gave me between first, but in the last days of the Soviet Union, then in Yeltsin, and now under Putin. I have to say that much of my writing is understood by readers, expert readers, market readers, to be about the power of the Russian oligarchs in metals, minerals, mining, shipping, and so forth. Most of my work's been focused on the way in which oligarchs do what you've just described, influence power in their direction. Lots of books about that, and thousands of Dances with Bears stories. I'm not saying that to promote myself or to beg you to read my books. What I can say, however, is that once we're at war, I don't talk about the oligarch businesses. I don't analyze them. My job was, inside Russia, to analyze what could be seen that not necessarily endorsed by the oligarchs, and see it and analyze it from the point of view of the national Russian interest, and analyze who benefited. Okay. Since the war and since the sanctions war came against the oligarchs, it's not a case of me burying my differences with Oleg Deripaska, who made some effort to kill me back in 2009. He didn't like my reporting about how he was trying to list his company. That story's told in The Man Who Knew Too Much About Russia. We aren't burying the hatchet, but during wartime, I can't allow my reporting to give aid and comfort to the enemy. And in this case, each side is at war with one another. Now, that's me. So I don't get into any longer, let's call it the secret business of the oligarchy on the Russian side. However, you asked a different question, which deserves to be answered. How did that generation of oligarchs influence President Putin's decision-making for this war? Is anyone opposed to the war? As the US and the British governments, for example, thought they would be opposed, and they were. And some more explicitly than others. We won't bother mentioning the names. But did the campaign to make them influence Putin succeed? No, it's been a total failure. Except that President Putin has to represent and balance there is a Russian democracy. Democracy requires political balance between public opinion, between the major owners and controllers of the economy, and the major forces of decision-making, civilian and military and intelligence services. He has to balance. When you balance, you have to listen. Now, President Putin used to have an oligarch's Christmas dinner every year. For several years, there was a Christmas dinner somewhere between December 10 and December 31. He would have the oligarchs come to the Kremlin, and they'd have a kind of public talk show, and then they would have a private dinner. Now, since about 2018, this is the people who attend this dinner became shy of having their names, because that was an invitation to the Washington sanctions warmongers to sanction them, as they did. So the Christmas oligarch dinner has stopped existing because we're at war. Does that mean that the oligarchs aren't critical of the administration on this issue or that issue? Yes, they're profoundly critical, as they are throughout the Russian balancing act, if you like, of 18, 19, 20% central bank interest rates, which have crushed the economy and have done far more damage to the Russian economy and its warfighting morale and capacities than any missile, any drone fired at the Russian hinterland by the Ukrainians, by the British, or by the Americans. So yes, there's vivid, active criticism of internal economic policy as to who should benefit, who should generate the growth that keeps the Russian people happy, keeps them employed, keeps everybody behind President Putin, as everybody is to a greater extent than anywhere else that political leaders have anywhere else. But to go back to the one point you make, yes, there's oligarch criticism. Yes, there are oligarch or a leading sector interests in the way the war's being run. Would they prefer to go back to business as usual, symbolized by Kirill Dmitriev and his peace tunnel? Yes, they would. Does it make a significant difference? No, on the battlefield. Does it make a significant difference in the diplomacy? Yes, it does. But if the US side keeps pushing their war for their oligarch interests, as we began with, the oligarchs cede their place on the front to the military men.
I remember, John, when the war in Ukraine started and the new sanctions came and they were imposed on Russian oligarchs, it was a moment that Putin came out and said, if you cannot, talking to oligarchs, if you cannot help Russia, you better, we don't need you if you cannot help us. How do you find the position of these oligarchs in Russia since the war in Ukraine started? Did their position have been somehow influenced drastically, or I'm talking about their influence on the foreign policy of Russia because of the nature of sanctions and what has happened between the West and Russia? What is the position of these oligarchs in Russia today compared to what it was before the conflict in Ukraine started?
Well, in a word, they're a lot quieter. First. Second, there have been some demonstrations, haven't there? Yevgeny Prigozhin accumulated, let's say, approximately $1 billion in wealth, which he intended to expand both as a contractor to the military in warfighting and as a warfighter himself. And he, as we all know, paraded himself on the battlefield, representing his men as he talked, and became a political critic of the chief of the general staff, the defense minister, and indirectly the president himself. The Prigozhin lesson, the attempt to rebel, the attempt to turn criticism into more money inside, more influence inside the defense ministry, as Prigozhin was seeking, and more political influence on the presidency, as the rebellion indicated, ended negatively at one point for Prigozhin, when he continued, despite the relatively peaceful ending of his rebellion, he continued to, and thus violated the, please be quiet now, Yevgeny, go to Africa, lose yourself, you're out of politics now. When Prigozhin wouldn't accept that, the demonstration effect is pretty obvious. He died. So what does that tell anyone with comparable ambition inside Russia? Be quiet. Negotiate your patch. Don't get ambitions beyond your means. Conserve your means, because the implications, the consequences when we're at war could be seriously negative for you. That's the Prigozhin lesson for everybody. As President Putin indicated to Mikhail Khodorkovsky years before, when we weren't at war. You want political ambition? You want to sell us to the United States? You want to replace me as president by yourself? Those were the challenges Mikhail Khodorkovsky threw at President Putin. And the lesson was, he ended up in prison for 10 years and is exiled to make noise, small noises in London. Be quiet. Look after, tend your own garden. And they do. Without getting into the names, there's diversification into military vehicles and all sorts of military technology, which is funded by the state. Oligarchs prefer state money. It comes cheaper and it comes more easily than capitalist competition. These aren't icons of capitalism. They're icons of the oligarch system, which is different on both sides. Both sides.
Yeah. John, going forward with the meeting between Trump and Putin, what is, in your opinion, what are the concessions that Russia can make in the process of negotiations with the United States? Is there anything, anything surprising for the United States on the part of Russians to offer?
I'm sorry, you mean, are the Americans surprised, or
No, is Russia prepared to offer something surprising for the Americans that they thought, Americans somehow thought that Russia would not concede on that? Russia would not, back down on that issue. Or, as we know, the position is still the same, and they're not going to change just, I don't know, a single, inch. That is a solid position on the part of Russians.
On the surface, President Putin, Mr. Lavrov, everyone who represents Russia in these negotiations shows maximum respect for President Trump as the president of the United States. And to some extent, they will flatter him, as the Europeans do, ingratiate, promote him for the Nobel Peace Prize and that sort of thing. under the surface, which was tested in Alaska by President Trump and President Putin together, under the surface, and then in the telephone call recently, they're testing the fundamental issue. On the one hand, we have to understand what the Americans think. On the other hand, we have to think what the Russians think. And then on the other hand, we have to think, we bring him in, Prime Minister Modi of India, because this is how the Americans think right now. This is how the ventriloquist doll, President Trump, has articulated how they think. They think that the threat of Tomahawk or long-range missile attacks launched, US-made, US crewed, but run through NATO, paid for by NATO, and then launched from the Ukrainian battlefield into Russia, frightens, deters, and will cause Putin to make territorial and other concessions. They think that. They then also think that economic warfare still to come. Trump's announcement that he had persuaded Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government to stop buying Russian oil. The Americans think, the American side thinks, the Trump circle thinks, as do the Europeans, that if Russia's oil trade is cut off, the economic loss is so serious, President Putin will come and make the kinds of concessions you just asked about. So now that's what the US side thinks. We can come to the Russian side and then the Indian side as an example to answer your question. I have to acknowledge that a colleague of mine, Jim Jatras, a former State Department official, has been spelling this out nice and clearly for everybody since he did a good article in December of last year. On the one hand, as Jatras and I and lots of others have pointed out, and everyone on your podcasts point out, the immediate ceasefire demand is unacceptable because it simply becomes an opportunity to snatch victory for the Ukrainians from the defeat they're suffering at Russian hands. And Russians understand this. So the underlying problem is, can the Russian side trust any commitment, any signed agreement, any provision on a Russian concession that the US side will make? Answer, no, they can't. You can't trust anything the Americans offer, not Witkoff as negotiator, not Rubio as negotiator, not Trump as a negotiator. And we've just seen, and the Russians are not blind, no one's blind, we've just seen 2 rounds of negotiation end in war and more war, despite a so-called Trump ceasefire. We saw it with Iran and we saw it with Gaza. Can Russia be so simple-minded as to fail to draw that conclusion? So in a sense, the answer to your first question is yes, there have been Russian concessions which have been gossiped about in the unreliable media of the West. Second, if you offer a concession to an American negotiator, can they, in accepting it at the negotiating table, implement it and stick to it for more than a few days? Answer, what does Witkoff's offers to the Iranians amount to? A deception before US and Israel attacked Iran. What does Witkoff, Kushner, and Trump's undertakings for Palestine amount to? Nothing much that lasted more than 5 days? So we could go into the minutiae of territorial concessions on Donbass, and we've already referred to the fact that Trump is fixed on the territorial lines because he thinks immediate ceasefire on the line is what the Russians will accept. Well, they won't. The ceasefire is unacceptable, and Russia is advancing further and further westward and destroying the entire energy, rail, and other infrastructure that supports the ongoing war. So there has to be a demilitarized zone between the lines, and Russia's position is all of the four regions, Donbass, Novorossiya plus Crimea. There has to be a demilitarized zone between that western border and the range in which the Ukrainian and American and British and French and other militaries launch their missiles and drones at the new Russia and the hinterland of Russia. A demilitarized zone can be policed by drones, by automatic or AI means, and then the question is, what kind of peacekeeping arrangement would you have on the western side of the militarized, and what kind of inspection regime, and who? Well, the Russian side says no Europeans have been fighting us. Well, we've seen what's the American contribution or the Anglo-American contribution to credible peacekeeping? It's the Board of Peace, the BOP, that Trump proposed with Tony Blair as a sort of chief executive to implement some sort of stooge force composed of Pakistanis and others, but subject to Israeli military control for disarming Hamas. I mean, if we just compare the one and the other, we understand that whatever the US side puts on the table, the Russian side can't accept that these are security guarantees that Russia could rely on. So if you can't accept, because the US is proving unreliable, demilitarization guarantees, now you can't accept denazification guarantees. Those are the two strategic objectives. You can't allow the rump Ukraine to rearm and to remain a platform. But if the US side says we won't, is President Putin ready to say, okay, you won't? Well, how can I be sure, given your recent history? Maybe President Putin isn't so polite. Maybe he's more polite. But the underlying problem, Foreign Minister Lavrov has just said it this morning in Moscow, the underlying problem is less we can get the US side and the European side to accept the root causes are themselves attempting to destroy Russia and commit to an enforceable mutual security pact. What can be relied on except a pause for the resumption of fighting? And as we've just tried to say, that poses a serious financial problem, a power problem for the American side, the European side, not to mention Zelensky getting rich in Lvov and in Poland, wherever it is that he functions these days. So does that sound like an impossible structure of distrust to resolve at a summit meeting? It sounds pretty impossible, doesn't it? Everybody listening can put on their thinking caps and say, well, how could you do it if you're in that position? Can you accept something so temporary? The Trump peace plan for Palestine in the Middle East has just lasted 7 days. Well, so if President Putin says, I support you for next year's Nobel Peace Prize, let's go to Budapest and have a stage show, there's a serious problem on the Russian side of understanding what's the point of this stage show if he is inherently as reliable as we've just seen in Gaza or we've just seen in Iran. And now there's one other party that's left, one other point that I indicated, the US side believes. They think cutting off India's purchases of oil from Russia will do the trick. In other words, the mentality isn't mutual indivisible security and guarantees. It's intimidate and enforce on the weak man. You will do what we want. That's the mentality. I think we've just explained why that's not exactly going to work for a winning army on a losing battlefield. So then they think Prime Minister Modi called Trump and said, we'll cut off the oil. Well, he didn't telephone. My Indian sources say there was a message. It was delivered to Trump by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of India, whose name I'm looking down to get it right, Kirti Vardhan Singh, who represented Mr. Modi at the Sharm el-Sheikh summit meeting last week. There's a message, but the Indian side, if you allow me to go into it a little bit, is very interesting. The Indians have the same problem of US pressure on as Russia does. And President Putin will be in Delhi to meet Mr. Modi on December the 6th, and they can swap tails. But it's obvious the US side has now taken over the Pakistan military. And so India understands, having defeated Pakistan in a recent war, defeated and imposed its terms on Pakistan, understands that the US is rebuilding the Pakistan military as a platform to attack Iran in the West and India again in the East. The Indian side understands that the CIA has covert operations. We know President Trump publicly endorses covert operations against regimes he's against, like Venezuela. There is covert operations inside India against Modi to support the Gandhi family, to support the Congress opposition party. India understands without being impolite to Mr. Trump that there's covert US operations. Then there's US influence on the Indian eastern border in Bangladesh. Then India faces a northern challenge from China. Well, my Indian sources say, look, we can try to pacify Trump, but we won't be blackmailed and we won't be bullied. We understand our national interests. Our oil trade will be governed by our national interests. And that's how Ministry of External Affairs in India has responded. That's how to the reported telephone call that wasn't a telephone call, but was a message between Modi and Trump. It's very important to understand how similarly Modi feels India's position to be, with President Trump understanding how Russia's position is. And they are strategic allies in supplying arms, in long-term political support. But let's look at it. India, and this is the Modi surprise that Trump and his men haven't thought of, India is one of the world's largest importers of foreign-made arms, $15 billion worth last year. The US side want to compel India to buy F-35s. The Indian side has made political decisions to buy French aircraft. It's on offer to buy the Su-57, and compared to the F-35, which is incredibly expensive and incredibly inefficient and unreliable in military terms, the Russian offer is a good one. But Trump doesn't understand that Modi has his own military weapon for the United States, and that's to cut off all prospect of military purchases. Second, as I've said, India will not tolerate US meddling on its borders against India. And it has the same problem we've just spelled out. that President Putin has with the US and the Europeans in the Ukraine battlefield and everywhere else. So India and Russia, Mr. Trump and his ventriloquists can be sure of, will not abandon each other under an American pressure game, which the Indians understand will ultimately destroy India in the same way Trump and the Europeans want to destroy Russia. That's not going to happen. How the oil trade will be managed, whatever sanction the Americans put on the Indians and the Russians, is a decent enough commercial secret. And you shouldn't believe, nobody watching should believe anything they read in Bloomberg, Reuters, or any of the so-called oil trade media who are fed ideological war-making propaganda.
Yeah. I think the Indian factor in the whole calculation is somehow it's so important on the part of Russians and on the part of Americans. But as you mentioned, India is not going to sacrifice its security, its national interest because of the relationship with anybody. As I understand it, they don't.
And here's an extra, I'm sorry to interrupt, Nima, because I agree with what you were saying. Here's another Modi surprise. India will increase its relationship in economic trade and investment with China. The more pressure Trump thinks he's placing on India to break its relationship with Russia, the more pressure will encourage India to make the kinds of accommodations the Chinese and President Xi and Prime Minister Modi have already been discussing. China is a major potential adversary of India. The Indians all accept that. They have fought border engagements. They have to worry and prepare for any form of Chinese war. But the more threatening war, US plus Pakistan or US plus Bangladesh, the more threatening the US wants to be with India, the more there will be an entente at certainly at trade and investment level, then transport logistics across the north of India and so forth. The more entente there will be between China and India will give up. Nothing public, nothing dramatically obvious. It's former relationship with Pakistan, so that Field Marshal Azim Munir will become, as many folks point out, the favorite soldier next to the Israelis for President Trump's White House. That has a surprise boomerang effect. And India and China are about to teach the United States how boomerangs work.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, John. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima. Let's see how the world looks next week.
Yeah, exactly. See you soon.
Thank you.